Okay, hey guys. Let me set some context up for you before we jump in this, and I'll introduce myself, but I'm going to talk about the topic first, and then I'll introduce myself. Kind of what you can expect out of this talk. You're not going to see any epic hacks here, and there's a reason for that. There's a lot of that out there. You're going to find a lot of people doing that, and they're going to have some great stuff, and I'm one of their followers. So there's no sense of me regurgitating a lot of that. I am going to talk technical, and we are going to get into some technical stuff. If you're a new person, this talk's for you. And matter of fact, if you are one of the new people in the room, you're probably you are the most important person in the room. So if you don't know anything about pen testing and you're just curious and you want to know, you're in the right place. That's the whole reason why the meeting exists. It's actually for you. So don't be afraid to ask questions. If you're an old timer, in the room, and you've been pen testing for a long time, some of the topics and some of the ways I may think about things and do things may be a benefit to you, but it may make a more compelling executive summary for you. You may find things, or if you're a person that has to review a lot of pen testing reports, this may change the difference between, hey, we didn't find anything, to, hey, we pwned everything. We basically compromised everything, and here's your data. So there's stuff in there for you too. I can't possibly talk about all the things that have to do with sensitive data. It's a very vague topic, and I intentionally did it that way. But there are tools, so I'm going to talk about tool talks, but I'm agnostic. It doesn't really matter what tool it is for me. It's a matter of getting to what I want. So that's kind of what it is, but I want to set that up before we kind of move forward. Any questions about that? Okay, cool. And the other thing I want to talk about is that for me, this is kind of like a thought experiment. It's me challenging myself. I ask myself a question when I do things, and then I do research to try to solve it. And it may be something simple, like something that everybody's done before from a pen testing point of view, but I just don't know how to do it. So I want to know what it is. But sometimes I had the habit of asking strange questions, or questions for me that challenge myself. So that's kind of how this came about. But before we start, let me introduce myself. My name's Darin Fredde. I'm a pen tester for US Bank during the daytime. I do a lot of internal pen tests. I also do pen tests on the side. So I've done external pen tests, limited, but I've done external pen testing. I've taught before, at Richmond College. That's probably going to go away. You'll probably see that come off my resume. It's not that I don't want to teach, it's that I'm heavily focused in another area right now. So I may remove that. Although I really enjoy teaching, it's a fun thing for me. I really enjoy interacting with people. So that's it. I have a CISSP like most people do. I have a master's degree in cybersecurity from the University of Dallas. So don't throw stones at me or anything for people who are not academic. But I got mine later in life. I didn't get it right away. Matter of fact, I never even went to high school. So if that makes you feel better, never had a high school degree, never went to high school. So, but later on, I saw the value in it, and it was kind of a living amends for my father. So I went and got it, and I'm not unhappy that I did do that. It's a great university. Can't say enough about it. I also ended up getting this certification that nobody knows about, but I went ahead and got that too when I was first getting in, and then some of the other ones you recognize. I'm chasing the OSCP like most people in the room. If you're not familiar with that, that's an offensive security practice. I mean, it's an offensive security certification. It's more of not a test taking deal. It's more of why don't you hack all these boxes 24 hours and give me a deliverable and a report. It's a very challenging test. So like most people, I'm chasing that. And for the newcomer, if you're in the room, again, I told you the most important person in the room. So I want to tell you a couple of things about that. As Philip told you, it's not my first rodeo. I've been around for a while in the IT arena, and I started out probably a long time ago, and I'm not doing this to brag. I'm just telling you that in those times, I kind of learned some skills that I use today because there was no URLs and things like that. So a lot of stuff that I had to learn were self-taught. I had to reverse deal. And I'm one of those guys that got real obsessive with like anything. Like, yeah, I'll read the facts manual, give it to me. And I would read that stuff because I saw a way out. And for me, a way out meant how to change my circumstances because my life was much different back then. So I kind of started at that level and I rode that industry for a long time. But prior to that, as Philip said, I had a whole long history of being a structural engineer. I mean, not a structural engineer, but a structural detailer and computer aided design. And so did Philip. And that's actually where I met him. And neither one of us were in IT. So we've had kind of some parallels in our life. And then later on, when I was looking for a mentor, what better person to grab? So I grabbed Philip. And what that does for you, if you're a guy like me, is that accelerates your career. So I get the advantages of hitchhiking off of Phil, and I hold my thumb out, and I get to ride along with his career and accelerate it and get it much faster than I would have normally got. So, you know, a lot of that is the blessings of that and meetings like that and coming in here. So if you're new, you're in the right spot. Don't be afraid to ask questions or any dumb questions. And my question is related to this. But before we start, let's talk about what an internal pen tester is. Seniors in the room are going to know it, but let me just kind of set some context for about what we're about to jump into. We're talking about specifically an internal pen test because it makes it easy to talk about this topic. And an internal pen tester is basically where you take on the mind of an attacker, and it means that you think and act like an attacker. You typically are going to start out post the firewall or inside the perim. It either can be an authenticated account that's handed to you where you have a low-level domain account with no rights, or it can be unauthenticated where you got to capture your kills. Different internal pen tests may run differently. I don't know what they are on the street, but those are the ones I'm familiar with. And when I start those pen tests, this last sentence is what really caught my attention and always does. If you read the last part, it says, applications are sensitive data using both automated and manual tools. And what really caught my attention is that I really play the role. I kind of joke around and tell people I'm not a bad guy, but I play one on TV. And what I mean by that is that I really take it seriously in my head. When I get into that headspace, I'm a thief. And that's what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to commoditize data in order to steal it to sell it on the underground market. And I kind of start with that behavior in mind. And then when I look at what job it is, I kind of look at the industry, whether it's medical, I may be looking for ETL processes, which are like extraction, transfer, and loads, you know, middleware concepts and moving medical data. Or if it's a financial system, I may be looking for financial things, or if it's an intellectual property. And I kind of think that way. And I kind of set that in mind. And if it's Citrix, then it's kind of wide open, the products I can choose and stuff. And I start with the end in mind. And one could say, hey, you're just a rookie and you're not a very good hacker, and that's why you do that. Yeah, one could say that. But I pwn quite a bit of stuff this way. And pwn is a little slang word to mean own it. So do I get domain admin? Yeah, I've gotten domain admin doing what I'm doing, and I'm about to explain that to you, and I'll show you some examples of that. But I noticed that I get people's attention when I'm writing an executive summary, and I not only tell you that I've got in these systems, but here's the death certificate of all your latest deceased people. And I know it's inflammatory, but that value of that paper is much higher, you know, and financial companies are going to have them because you're the spouse and you have to prove that that person's deceased. So that sounds gross, but those things do happen and it has more value. And there's things like that. And I notice their eyebrows raise, and I tend to get a lot of attention, and I like attention. And I get a lot of momentum for getting things resolved, which means the whole point of being a pen tester is you're not only supposed to be hacking things, but you're supposed to motivate them to fix things, because that's the whole point of the pen test, or one of the points, or should be. Told you I was talking about sensitive data, so let's kind of define that for this talk. I kind of have an umbrella, and I'm calling it sensitive data. It means exactly what it means in a traditional sense of what you guys that are blue teamers in the room, defenders, red teamers, old timers have been in room, scope presenters, all that. You guys understand sensitive data. It's personal information, you know, Social Security, first name, last name. It can be the traditional sense. It can be credit card data. It can be healthcare data. But for me, I expand the scope to also mean IT data, map, passwords, things like that, because those are things you don't want me to have. So I kind of umbrella the topic to mean a lot of that. So you're going to, when you hear me talk about it, I'm going to talk in that context. But don't think I don't know the difference between the two. I just make the umbrella really wide because it's real easy. Then I don't have to define what it is because we're not talking about a blue teamer. However, I started out with telling you that this talk's for a lot of people. If you are on the blue team side and you like this topic, I have a whole nother talk that deals with a SIP, which is Sensitive Protection Program, and how to do that and how to establish that in your company. The next thing, as far as expectations of the way I present, I do have slides, but if you notice, I don't read them. So they're for you to read, and they're there just in case you forget what I say. And at the back, I give you a whole list of my references. So I cite my work. So you have a references to get back to everything that I talked about and who actually may have said it if I didn't quote them correctly. And not only that, you don't get bored with somebody just sitting there reading a slide, okay? So I'm not going to read all this, but you'll hear me talk a little bit. So for the person listening or the people on the line, if you're seeing the slide, sometimes my words may not match up with the slide, and it's because the slide's a visual cue for me. Got it? So back to sensitive information. Let me tell you how this came up for me. I told you it was a question I asked myself. This is what happened to me. I was a blue teamer at that time. And what that means is I worked on the defensive side, and I was a defender versus what I do today, which is an attacker. And by the way, you won't hear me say, when I say hacker, you won't hear me say that in the context of criminals. They're two different people. Criminals are criminals. Hackers are guys like us. And ethical, we're not bad people. So you'll hear me make a distinction. I may say threat actor. You may hear me say that to describe them. I don't like putting it in that context. But you're going to hear me take on that persona, and I am going to talk if I offend you because I'm talking about death certificates, stuff like that, or social security numbers and things. You just got to understand that's just a role I'm playing, and I would never take your data. Anyways, sorry about that. How this topic came up for me was I challenged myself. I said, okay, I'm an attacker. I'm going to steal your data. And I started thinking, well, how do I do that? I mean, it's not how do I get into the box. I can get in it, and I can gain access to it. I can compromise the machine, but how do I find it? And then how do I deal with it? And then how do I deal with it with the time period I have? And how do I search for it? And not only how do I find it, but how do I search within the content of the file? Because remember, it's not just finding the file, it's in the content. Because when we talk about sensitive data, I'm talking about unstructured data. And what that means is not in the big data sense, we're talking about data that's scattered. Because here's the truth. Half the companies don't know where their data is. If you really ask them and do the research, the truth of the matter is not in the database. They don't really know, and it's scattered to the winds. Because there's ETL process I mentioned before, extractions, transfers and loads, and that's kind of a middleware concept to move data between systems, which are targets for me. So data doesn't stay in one place, and it's also forgotten about, and it's at rest. And all that data is just out there. And that's why everybody gets compromised a lot. So instead of taking on the ivory tower and trying to fight your firewall, why not just steal your backups? You know, do smart things like that, or find open shares and steal the data out of the shares, or find encoded passwords, real simple stuff. But again, it brings me back to the question, how do you find it? Not only how do you find it, but how do you search in the file, and what tools are they? So I would ask a lot of people. I'd go around and I'd ask people that have been in business, how do you do that, man? How do you find unstructured data and things? And I started coming up with some roadblocks. And I'm not saying it's not out there, because we're going to talk about tools in a minute, but I'm going to tell you that I didn't get a satisfying answer that worked for me. So I was left to kind of research this my own, and this is how this came about. Plus, remember I told you I started on the blue team? They gave me that project, and I hated it. I'll be honest with you. I was on the blue team side, and I was like, that is not sexy. Uh, Finding, DLP stuff, hey, that's not my deal. Security architect, I like that. Security engineer, that stuff's cool. Threat hunting, I'm not doing that. And I was really kind of upset that they gave it to me. But I had no choice. So I approached it like I do everything. I gave it a full effort. I did a POC to look for tools, and I kind of did all the analysis on it. And through that process, I realized some sobering facts. And here's a couple of them you probably hadn't thought of. It's not about the data you have. It's about data that people bring to you too. And this is what happened. Lady found about 1 million social security numbers, and literally, that's not hyperbole, about 1 million social security numbers on a box. And she was a developer, and she was doing payroll. And she had went from company to company, and she had a nice little development database, and developers do that. And in there, she had left the data. So this was a company that had been broken into twice with credit card data. Can you imagine them trying to explain how they lost 1 million records and it's not their data? So it's not just about the data that's there. It's also not about taking the data. Sometimes it's about the integrity of the data. Like, why don't I just jack your data up and then make you do all your analysis in the wrong area while your competition beats you? So you kind of got to think that way. It's attackers don't, it's not necessarily about taking it. And it's also about the integrity of the data, and it's also about your internal threats. Because remember, there may be people that are less genuine than me that are gray hats, people who do both sides of the fence. They're a little unethical when the opportunist comes up, or they're just downright black hats. They're thieves, and they'll steal your data, and they could be actually working for you. Just because you went through a background check doesn't mean anything. Maybe they never got caught because they're real good at it. So it kind of became an eye-opening topic for me, and let's jump into it. So here's the problem scenario I just described to you. Pen testers don't have a lot of time sometimes. You get a job, you get a scope, you got 5 days to do it, and that's your deliverable too, a report and all that, and you got to search through this mountain of data you just confiscated. Okay, that's our first problem. The other thing is, if you're on the red team, if you just blindly go hopping around, chances are you're going to get caught. So you can't just go blindly jumping around trying to find things. And that's what I got here. And then if you also look at the lack of tools, I challenge you, unless you challenge me back, and I'd love to hear from you offline, is that there's one tool that I'm looking at right now called Scavenger. It has a lot of press. You're going to find a lot of hits on it if you Google it. But it just ain't, it isn't doing it for me. I just haven't found that tool that does that automation for me. Now you can write bash scripts and do it for yourself, and regexes, and we're going to talk about all that in a minute. But I just noticed that there was tools. So we're going to talk about some tools. But this is if we were going to say, what's the problem? This is the problem I'm talking about. Okay, Nessus. Nessus, you can use Nessus, and you could put Nessus is a vulnerability scanner for people that don't know, and you could put an account on there, an authenticated account. You can search for data, in fact, but it's limited. Go ahead, give it a shot. You're going to find some stuff if you're doing vulnerability assessments, and it'll work for you, but it's limited. And then also, I would challenge you as a pen tester. Pen testers are responsible for finding vulnerabilities this way, leaking data vulnerabilities that exist in apps. And I'm going to give you a couple examples in a minute of vulnerabilities that were there that nobody knew by looking for unstructured data. It also could lead to footholds, like what I'm saying. You can get a foothold on a box by just finding passwords or encoded passwords. You get a WebEx and then follow that up by an attack. So unstructured data and sensitive data can be responsible for footholds. They can be responsible for an entire collapse of a domain. And I'll show you an example of that. For people that are new in the room that haven't done this, when you do findings, we call them findings, other pen testers. So a finding is exactly what I'm saying. Like, say I find data in a company and I find it on open share. When we put that in our reports, we call it a finding. And this is kind of what a finding looks like. And that's the why I highlighted it red, because open shares are pretty much the dominant factor for finding things. And so I put that, but I showed you other ones too. So confidential data would fall in one bucket because that's not really an open share. That's people, you know, putting social securities or W-2s or tax forms, things like that. There's hard-coded passwords are encoded, so you have to have a finding for that. So that's all this is just for people that aren't familiar with writing reports, how you would label those, and we call them findings. I told you I'd give you some examples to kind of get you fired up about the topic. This is one that I found, actually, and this software, I'll tell you a little bit about it. It's called BMC Patrol. It's a very known software. Some people use it for statistical data, for capacity planning for servers, for load balancers to kind of give them data. And what it does is it has this UDR file, which is just a fancy way of saying that it's a universal data repository. It's just basically a text file. And in those files, it has logs, and then it has this little interface. And what happened was, it's kind of like this. It was backwards. I found the bullet, and then I went for the gun, because the bullet was me finding the credentials. So then the back end for me was explaining why I found the credentials, even though I used them to get into systems, but also exploit it. So that's why I know so much about the system. It wasn't because I'm familiar with it and I searched it out. It's because I did my research, pivot around, look at my research. And what happened is this app was leaking data. And this one little line the vendor gave them is all they gave them. So it isn't like a big patch came out and said, hey, we're leaking data. They were actually leaking data, and it was periodic. So I think out of these records I climbed through, I'm doing other things, and then I usually set things searching. And I was climbing through records looking for things, and I got a hit, and I started looking, and I noticed the pattern. I followed the pattern, and that's how this one got revealed to me. Once I got into that system, I used their own interface, and I go into their interface right here. And I like this one because I like to use tools against people. So what I did is I took their interface, and I soaked this for you, and I took their own console, and instead of having to go to every machine, I just pulled all the UDR files to me, because I was already in that server, and then I just would go through them on the one server to pwn other servers. And so I did that as a deal. And I'm not telling you that to be clever. I'm telling you that to be unique, because it's the way you think. It's not the tool. It's the way you exploit a tool for using it for something that it wasn't designed to actually use it for. So I used that, and I actually did that. And so I liked it, and I like doing that a lot. I like to do kind of manual things. Here's an IBM system, same thing. WebSphere, most people are going to see WebSphere, a lot of the seniors in the room, and they're going to go, yeah, of course. WebSphere is known to have a lot of problems and with security holes. But what they don't know is this FFDC log. So it's a log that is called a first failure data write. Now, this is the needle in the haystack. What happened on this one is that out of every record, when this app was interrelated through a SOAP connector. So let's just pretend, for the sake of people who are maybe not as technical, it was just a way of connecting. And somewhere along the line, they were using basic authentication, which is a finding in itself. And then what would happen is the timeout on the SOAP connector, which was a IBM problem 846, would leak the AD credentials in the log. And I had access to the logs, because I was filtering data. I go through a lot of unstructured data. I go through data that you wouldn't think, like a print server. We'll talk about that in a minute. Most people would go, a print server? Why would you go to a print server? Here's the one I told you about, a sysvol. This is old, so a lot of people in the room are real familiar with this, but I want to talk about this for just a second. If you look for this, you're going to find it. My references have it. So if you want to know how to do this hack, just follow my reference. But what it is every domain controller, when you enter an environment, is really open to everybody. It's because domain controllers allow you to query them. And in the sysvol directory, a lot of times in the old school, they didn't have a way to change local passwords, so they would change them in there. So this password's in there if you're not familiar with this. And these are the two folders I'm showing you, the sysvol directory. And there's Microsoft publishing the key for cracking all the encryption they have. So it's pretty easy hack. And this company, I compromised their whole environment by doing this. And it took me probably, and it's not because I'm great. It's just I went in and did this first before I even started hacking, and then I just got lucky. And they were doing it. I ended up getting their Citrix and everything else, and them making them scared of me and everything else. And that was prior to even going to pen testing. So if you're not a pen tester and you're on the blue team, some of these techniques can help you get in there. But we're going to talk about doing it responsible, because it can also get you in trouble. So we're going to talk about that. And I had permission. So, and that's the key point. But anyways, but think about this. This directory and these policies that you're about to climb through, it's not 1 or 2 files. And remember, it's searching in the file. So you're going to open all these up. That's what the deal is. And by the way, not even though domain controllers replicate these services over the other domain controllers, sometimes they're different domains. So you have to go to that domain too, because like a domain in the DMZ or something like that. So how do you, I'll back to my question. How do you search that? I mean, what do? Open up every single file and hope you get lucky? Needle in the haystack? Do you write a regex? You know, how do you, what tool do you use? Is it a Metasploit tool that you compromise a box and then you search through the box you're on? That's there. It's not on my slides because there's a lot of data on compromising exactly box, but you can kind of get where I'm going with this and why it was a challenge for me. Here's another example. This was a little program called Toad, and I was doing a Citrix breakout test, and the only thing they gave me was, and this is kind of a boring test for pen testers, they gave me a Citrix portal and some published apps, and that's all I had. And then I had an account with no data, and I think I maybe had 4 apps, and one of them was this one. So traditionally, you do what's called a breakout. And this one, to be honest with you, they were pretty weak. So breaking out of the system was really easy. So let me define that so I don't go too fast. A breakout method is basically when a Citrix app is published, they're trying to constrain you to just that interface. And what pen testers do is they break out of that Word document or that Internet Explorer, whatever, and they gain access to the server, and then it begins. Privilege escalation, lateral movement, you know, trying to move out in the environment, and they call that a breakout. It's incredibly hard to defend against, so my hat's off to the Citrix defenders. But what I want to show you about this is I actually didn't do the breakout. I could do it, but I just used a search engine because I knew this app had the ability to search within the context of files. And remember, that's key. And I knew that it supported regexes and a lot of other stuff. I just sat there on the outside, only authenticated with the portal, and searched their server because I already knew I could break out to the hard drive. So what you just see me searching is just for the simple word password and the C colon, and just let it fill up. And it's silly, but it works. And you'd be surprised what you can get by just simple things. So I would recommend, if you're a pen tester, whatever tool you're in, like you get a web interface on a box, search the web interface, look for ways that tool does search engines and things like that, and try to leverage that to your advantage. So that's why I use this example. One more thing about this, and on Citrix, just to kind of tell you about the executive summaries. I had another one that was Citrix like this, and I'll be honest with you, I got into the server and I had owned the Citrix servers, and I was on quite a bit. And the way I would move laterally is I would just launch another app, break into that server, launch another app, break into that server. So I was gaining access to all my servers, and that was great, but elevating up was difficult. They had a lot of protection environment, and I was being careful because I was trying to be, it wasn't a red team test, but I was trying to be conscientious of somebody knocking on my door and saying, hey, why are you running PowerShell and, you know, doing this on the Citrix server? And so what I did is I knew simple things for elevating my skills would work. So what I did is I did something real simple, just did a net stat, saw what was connected to me, and saw these 2 print servers. The print servers turned out to be 4,000 servers with open shares. So I went from 2 print servers connected to me. And what happened is I got on those print servers. And what I was really going after at that time is I was really going to dig deep. I was going to go into the printer buffers and, kind of do that and try to get some data off of there. But in the course of that, I said, hey, why don't I just check this server for its open shares? And I found this little open share. And then by the naming convention of all their servers, I realized, oh, they name their servers a certain way. So then I took that and went into PowerShell and enumerated all their servers. And then I had a nice little list. And then I took that list, and I'll show you what I did with it later in PowerView. I took that list and enumerated all that. And then I did what's called statistical sampling, because it was really what we call out of scope. At that time, if I had to win and started attacking all those servers, it'd been bad. But as far as I was concerned, the servers that were connected to the Citrix server are fair game. So I compromised a couple of them, displayed the data in my executive summary to get the attention, made reference to the open shares of the servers in the executive summary, and boy, did I get attention. So matter of fact, it became a lecture to our group about finding sensitive data. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because of this reason. And this is the part I told you at the beginning where I said handling things responsibly. There were 3 people in that group that I was really concerned about. One was managing a portfolio of about $9 million. And the other reason why is not because of that, because that's business related, but it was because I owned their life. I owned everything about them. And because users go to work and they think, hey, it's work, it's a place to keep your data. And users are very commonly keep password lists and their security questions. And I know that, that's why I do this, because you'd be amazed at what people, their tax records, their W-2s, their husbands' deals, and I had gathered all this stuff about this person, and this person was about to retire. I was intimate. I knew her first name, last name, her kids' names, and I was really concerned about that. And then I ran across another one, and I started seeing a pattern. So I thought, well, how do you deal with that? Because that could backfire. I call you up, hey, I'm doing a pen test. Your husband data is on there. It could go south on you real fast as a pen test, and it's not really something you do. So what I did on that particular one to handle that responsibly is I created a system called a sensitive data report, kind of did a separate short one-pager showing the compromise. And then the people who gave me the scope, I elevated upwards and said, hey, you need to get a hold of these people right away. And you need to ask them to, get it. Because those people had no idea that their data was being copied by the IT group and put on there. They were putting it actually on what they call thick client, and they had no idea it was going on there. So that's the way I handled it. The second thing I wanted to tell you, if you get really interested in this topic, because it's not a question of whether you're going to find stuff, you definitely are going to find stuff. It's a question of how you deal with it, because there's a thing called credential overload. And it's funny, I called Philip one time and I said, man, how do you deal with all these usernames and passwords? I mean, what do they go to? And, and how do you go through all this? This is Arsenal, and you got all these things. And so how do you handle that responsibly? Because there is a thing called getting hacked yourself, where, bad guys track you and hack you and steal your data. So you have to be real conscientious of that and handle that real responsible. So I kind of thought, if you're going to do this, you want to kind of think with the end in mind, how you're going to do with that. I don't know how they do it on external pen testers. You can ask some of the more experienced guys in the room, but that may be something you might want to think about in your engagement meeting or your kickoff meeting, and things like that. Let's move on. I told you I would kind of talk about things. So let's talk about sanitation, basically how you deal with your box. Because for me, it's not that I'm a Windows guy. I'm agnostic. I like Linux. I like it all. Mac, like them all. Some I'm better on, some I'm weaker on. But what happened was I was building Windows machines and using those because they're better sometimes inside of a domain, and they're better at a staging area. And I was using VMs, and then Philip came along and he goes, man, have you ever heard about Commander VM? And I go, no, but it sounds just like what I want. And he showed it to me, and with about 3 hours of script running, it basically sets you up like a Kali Linux box. And it's got all your scripts. It's got, so this is where we get into the tool talk. It's got PowerShell, everything you need. It dumbs your box down, baselines it to where your firewall is turned off, and everything you need for a pen testing box. And I was like, man, I love it. So this became my go-to. And then what I added is a couple other tools you would probably not think of as hacking tools. File seek. A couple people in the room are going, file what? File seek, and I'll explain why that's relevant. PowerView, of course, y'all know that one. Notepad++, people are going, text editor? Yeah. Sublime, I like them both. They both have pros and cons. Some of the tools, those are just to name a few. And I kind of add that and then do some custom things to it. So if you haven't checked this out, I would strongly encourage you to look at it. If you're new, this is a good place for you to start. And you can still do the Kali. Don't get dependent on tools, but definitely check it out. It's worth it. Okay, let's go through some basics, and we'll go through them fast, and I'm not going to read all this. There's tons of stuff out there on this, okay? I don't need to tell you how to use Nmap, but it usually starts with that and enumerating what shares are open. So this is just me keeping faithful to pen testing methodology, and I'm using just basically no pings, with the 445, and then I like to output that to a text file. Now I do this because I'm going to use that file later on, okay? You guys do it your own way. This is something I do, and this isn't the only thing I do. It's just one thing in the context of looking for 6-bit data. Now we're getting into some better stuff. Okay, say we're in the environment, and remember, you either starting with credentials and your box is part of the domain, or you're outside the domain. And remember, there are two different things, and they require two different planning stages. So if you're on Commander VM and you're outside the domain, you got to think about, hey, I'm running PowerView and PowerShell, but I'm not really authenticated. So you got to kind of think of how do you enumerate shares with all the stuff you're seeing online. How do you do that when you're outside the domain? So I gave you that up at the top. I'm kind of showing you in one context of how you do it if you're outside the domain and how you validate. If you're inside the domain, it's much easier, and you have a low-level account. And then what I want to draw your attention to about PowerView that I really like is these options: exclude standard and check share access. This will save you tons of time. So you want to exclude the standards because shares, you have hidden shares that you may not have access to with a low level account because it requires admin access. So that's like admin $, there's a couple other ones, doesn't really matter. But the bottom line is you're not going to get to those shares. So you want to exclude them, and this will give you the way to do it. And at the same time, you want this option because why waste your time trying to get into shares you can't get into with that account you're using? So this will actually check my access. So I take my list, this big text list of all my targets, I take them into PowerShell, I put my targets in there, and I basically enumerate shares. And these $signs are just Microsoft's hidden shares. So if you notice, I can already tell you from this list, I'm going to get something. Statistically, it's just going to happen. There's going to be something in here of value to me as an attacker. So when I see shares like this, I get really happy. I mean, it's rare that I don't find something. I get happy because this may be something I come back to. So what I do is I get this out of the way real fast. I enumerate my shares, get my shares, put them to the side. Then I'll show you this next slide. Am I boring you guys, by the way? Okay. If you want to ask questions, go ahead. If I'm talking too fast, or be sure and stop me. The next thing I do is they take advantage of an option they have. They have a file finder, and also there it's invoke file finder. So what I'll do is I use it, but to be honest with you, I kind of take it as a grain of salt. It's a lot of data. So when you go through file finder, if you do not declare a term, there's an option in the command line that I don't show here, but it's a dash term. If you put a dash term there, you can make up your own words. So what's really nice about that is, say your sensitive data is intellectual property. So I'll find out your naming convention, SharePoint, whatever, learn your vernacular you're using, and then I'll go after keywords doing this. I do this sometimes with encryption keys. So like if I want to look for encryption keys because maybe I got a finding where I'm running my vulnerability scanner and it says, hey, your encryption keys. I like to show people why that's a problem. So I'll go find the password, show their encryption, have their key and both sides of it and show them that. because most people that are in security know that you're not supposed to share the private key. And if I give them back all their private keys, it gets their attention on that, and it makes them more motivated to go fix what would normally be just, you know, one of these boring vulnerability things. So you can look for keys, but the default, if you don't check the default, this is a great tool. It'll do that for you. And, or you can add stuff in there. One more thing about this. Here's what I'd recommend if you want to do this, because we're about to jump into some more technical stuff. And what I would do is I'd get yourself some test data, because, and a good place to get it, I like to get it, is a company called Spirion. I'm not promoting them. That's a blue team package for like DLP, but they got some great test data and they share it online, and it covers everything from GDPR, you know, and all the different things. So I'll grab their test data, social security numbers and all that, and I use that test data to kind of home in my regexes to see if how they're working, to create in my lab, and then for this point, and this is for the seniors, to do data exfiltration. Because what really matters at the end of a report is, say as I loot a lot of your data, what if I really want to put the icing on the cake, I'll take it outside the company. But that's kind of irresponsible to take your data outside the company. What if I get hacked, or what if my payspin count gets hacked, or whatever? So I don't like to do that. What I'll do is I do it safely. I'll create some surrogate social security numbers, whatever they are, and simulate that, and then use that for my testing. And the same thing, it works for your lab too. Strongly encourage you to get that if you're starting out and you're messing with this stuff. Get you some test data, even if you are a pen tester, and start playing around with it. This looks intimidating, but let me explain it, okay? I'm not a regex guru. I can say it, I know what it is, I know it programs in different languages, and I have some of the switches memorized. But I'm not an expert. I know its limitations. I know what it can do with, regexes can do with other apps that also have like a control, like it has to be within so many characters of the regex that it finds. You know, that's smart software that does that. I know what a mod 10 is, which is a mathematical function for credit cards. But what this will do for you is I gave you a link, and most of the guys that know regexes already know these sites. And but what they may not know is a way to teach yourself. So what I did is, this is called a railroad diagram, and some people may be visual, and I'm a visual person. So I like dialogue. I learn that way. I like talking to people, but I also like looking at something visually. So this helps me kind of understand what the regex is doing. And you can go to that site and play around with your regex and go, oh, okay, I see what this thing's doing. So this is called a railroad diagram. It's very common in the programming world, but some of us may not be less interested. I mean, may not know about it. So that's there for you. This is an example of a regex that I've had pretty good luck with. And then there's just an arsenal. Let me talk about credit cards for a minute, because everybody thinks, oh, credit cards. Credit cards do about a 10% bust on false positives. And even with a mod 10, and a regex doesn't cut it. That's why a lot of DLP products sometimes are problematic with false positives. This is not a DLP talk, but the only reason why I want to tell you this is because if you're finding credit card data, you want to be careful with touting it is, hey, you got credit card data. So what I do is, I know regexes do that, so I'll do sampling on some of the data I find, make sure it passes a mod 10, and then the way I word it is I say, look, it's plausible that it is credit card data, it passed a mod 10, or it passes a LUN check. And that kind of lets me off the hook. Now, if they argue with me and say, no, it's not, then I have to kind of let go, because I'm not running it through a credit card bureau, and my job's done. So that's just one warning on credit card. I also want to mention, because it may not be in the slide, is CC search. Anybody heard of that? Yes? No? Okay. Google it. It's in my text, but there's a program called CC search. This guy wrote it. I'm sorry, I don't remember his name. And what it's real good for is it's if you're a command line guy like I am, you can take it in your Linux environment, run CC search. You can even run it on a PCAP. And what it does is it actually has a mod 10 and a regex, and it'll go through even a PCAP and show you if there's credit card data in there. And it's it's pretty credible as far as false positives. So if you haven't heard of it, it's called CC Search, just exactly the way I'm saying it. Google it, you'll find it. Put it in your tool bag. It's definitely something to have with you. I use that also. Notepad++. Who would think Notepad++ would be a hacker tool? Well, it is for me. I like to use it because, remember I told you I enumerate a lot of UNCs. So let's say a UNC path called a universal naming something, who cares? But the path is / server name or whatever. And let's say you got 200 of them. That's a lot. And then say that data is gigs of data. How do you go through that? And then how do you concatenate a bunch of UNCs as all one search engine? That's what kind of got me on this kick. So Notepad++, I don't like it for putting 10 UNC paths with comma separated, you know, on one path and doing one search at one time. Don't really like it for that. But, and then sometimes most IT people have this in the environment, so I steal their tool and I use it because, hey, thanks, you gave me Notepad++. And I've used this many times. I find it on the server and I use it to start going through my server using their tool. Notepad++, I'm using a Regex, and I think this is test data. I'm just showing you how I've got a simple regex. I've told it to use a regular expression, and I'm just searching to the table. So it's just some different ways to do things. Here's the same thing with Sublime. Sublime I like better. The only thing I don't like about it, a negative, is I like to kind of have a Zen-like feeling of what my tool is. I'm the kind of guy that puts on your nmat, I'm going -v because I like to watch the verbose. I like to see what's going on because I got a tendency to get complacent and come back, and it gives me a quick way to know what I'm doing. I don't like this tool. I haven't figured out how to kind of give me a status update. So if you guys figure that out, let me know. But I like it for finding things. Sublime, I like the interface, and I use it the same way I just described. And this is me using it. I'm obviously redacting the information, but I'm doing test act, and this has been responsible for finding a lot of stuff. I do this quite a bit. And if you're not using it, give it a shot, see what you think. Same thing here, except I'm concatenating 2 UNC paths together. I think the biggest thing I've ever done on one of these is I think I did maybe 14, 15 servers all at the same time. So I'm UNC and path and searching data at the same time. Now, if you're a red teamer, you're going, why aren't they knocking on your door? Well, why would they? It's open share. I'm just searching data. I'm just like anybody else. I guess you could catch me on the PowerShell side enumerating all your shares maybe, but haven't had a lot of knocks on the door like that doing this. Here's 57 servers I'm showing you. I've got 57 servers. Obviously, I can't show them to you, but I've actually concatenated 57 servers, UNC paths on this line, and I'm searching for password. And I think I ran that one 60 UNC paths, 57 servers. I think I let this one run for about a day after a box I owned, and I came back, and then I just started harvesting the data. But keep in mind, you could take this data offline and then write data about data and search within the context of this data and, you know, either grep it or something like that. I a lot of times don't do that. I just go through this window. My eye picks it up pretty fast. And a lot of those techniques I'm showing you, that's how I found things. And then I'll kind of back into it. Does it take time? Yeah. So you want to plan in your pen test to have time to do that. So protecting the penetration test data. We talked about that, but I want to go over that one more time. Remember, you know, you're dealing with people's data, so use test data. Don't use real data. Be aware of the tools you're using. Remember the tools you're actually using. They have vulnerabilities also. So even the tools you're using have vulnerabilities. So make sure your tools are patched, things like that. Some of the stuff you may be blogging about and talking about, that's one thing I get really scared about talking about this is, you know, you may be waving a signpost for people. So you want to be careful about what you're talking about and stuff. And then you want to maintain real detailed records because I guarantee you when you get their attention, they're going to want to know. I redact it from every report I do. When I produce a pen testing report, I redact the information out of the report, and then I tell them verbally, if you want the location, you can come to me, because I can't control the report. I don't know where it's going to go, and I don't want to be responsible for teaching somebody exactly where the data is. So you want to kind of keep that in mind too. And then don't be surprised if they react to it. You want to be careful about that. So you kind of want to start, like I said, with the end in mind of how you're going to deal with that. And then here's one last disclaimer, not to get on a soapbox, but I'm just telling you how I deal with it, because it's not an unusual case to happen. I'll give you 2 examples, because I've been doing this kind of thing for a while now, even when I was before I was a pen tester, and that is this one. And I'm going to I'm going to be a little vague about the topic, but if you're smart, you'll figure out exactly what I'm talking about. If it has to do with child and the other word that goes behind that, all bets are off. I don't care if you are the customer. I'm not talking to you about it. Going straight to the police department and going to create a police report, and I'm going to communicate from there, and my pen step stops. And I stop everything. I don't jack around with that. That's the way I handle it. Most professionals will tell you to deal with it that way, but you don't know who in the company had it. It's a criminal offense. I don't jack around with that. So that's my soapbox stand. The second thing I want to tell you is got to be careful about what data you get. And here's the story. I was at this company, and this guy asked me, he knew I liked doing this, and he said, hey, why don't you come in and kind of play around and see what you can do. So I came in, and I was a rookie, so I snuck in the conference room, and I was actually talking to Phil, and he said, hey, I was impressed with what you did. But I snuck in a conference room because I knew I could sit there a while, and I just act like I owned the joint and sat there and started doing this, and I found a honey hole. Because people have home directories, and once you get access to one person, typically their home directory goes everywhere they go, because it mounts up to them, and you can easily figure out people's home directories, and that becomes kind of a nice little honeypot for finding data not only in them, but other accounts you may get as you're doing lateral movement. So I started kind of doing that, and I started collecting an arsenal. And what I was wanted at this company, and there's judges involved and stuff like that, let's just put it that way. And I wanted financial data, and I really specifically wanted an ACH transfer. And that is financial data, like moving data, because I was just arrogant, and that's just what I wanted. And I ran across these bank accounts, and I thought I had them. And just to validate that I had them, I logged into them. Now, disclaimer, I since totaled myself, so it's no longer a felony, but it was because I logged into a bank that I did not have access to, and the person turned out to be a federal judge, which is an elected, not a federal judge, I'm sorry. He turned out to be an elected judge, which means the CISO get out of the car and may or may not work. He could say, hey, I don't care, that was my account. But I didn't know that, and I was kind of young in it. So my point of telling you that story is just be careful. You're going to find data, you're going to get data, be sure you pay attention to what data is. It could be somebody's personal data, and you want to be careful about how you validate that data to make sure that account authenticates. So enough of that. And then the last thing is clean up as you go, good OpEx. That's why I like the window box. You burn it down, it's gone. You don't have to worry about it. If not, you're stuck doing your native OS. And don't forget about the native OSs on the box itself. So conclusion, let's wrap up. What I talked to you about is I talked to you, if you're a newcomer, I told you ways of finding sensitive data. And hopefully I gave you a framework kind of, and I didn't necessarily tell you how to do it. I just kind of told you how to fish and told you ways of thinking. And if you're on the blue team, I gave you ways of thinking. And for the blue teamers, I want to make this real clear. Remember, this is data at rest. This is not data at motion. Your DL products are not going to find this stuff because this is data that's resting and unstructured. So in my humble opinion, the only way to really do this is be proactive. You have to start a campaign of looking for this data and constantly, and then build a kind of like a patch management program and pick whatever product whatever works for you, you know, of the DLP products out there. But you want a proactive approach. If you're a pen tester, I talked to you about baking this into your executive summaries. don't so much focus on the reverse shells, but also keep this going at the same time you're doing other things. Don't forget about this. And last thing on that point, I was reviewing this report just the other day because I started reviewing reports, and I was reviewing a pen test report, and the guy said, and this is not to put him down to make me better, just tell you what I'm talking about. His executive summary said, hey, search through shares, didn't find anything. And I knew that it wasn't true because I've done a lot of that. So I looked at his report, and then what I went and did is I went and got the WebSphere admin account, grabbed it, and then in his executive summary, instead of putting it in the markup, you know, on the write-up, I texted him and said, hey, here's the WebSphere. Why don't you do this and get into this box with this password and do like a WAR file upgrade, which he would be an expert at, right? But he wasn't an expert at finding the data. He missed it, and there was a lot of it. So think about that. His executive summary was pretty boring, to be honest with you, and it was pretty weak as far as what he found. Now think about what that executive summary says. It says he got into your WebSphere, had admin, got into your SQL databases and all your backends, because that's exactly where all this leads. Because most likely if you get in a WebSphere, it means it's encoded. So that means you're actually going to find ODBCs and other things. And another thing about that too, to go off the reservation on this, is remember a spreadsheet's a simple spreadsheet. There's ODBC drivers and things people do if you're data people, and sometimes they bury the credentials in their spreadsheets and then they leave them. So make sure you open up the spreadsheets and investigate them, because I find them all the time, and you want those because I don't even need to know the password for that. I just click on the file and extract the data all there and steal it. So, and people do that all the time. Another thing, Word documents in what they call the metadata, that's data about data. That metadata, and that's what I mean by searching through files, are tips that tell you, hey, please come look in this file because I password protected it. And those are big warning signs for you to go, hey, I go steal those and I take them offline and I crack them and crack the passwords and get into those. And a lot of times those are Word documents with all their passwords or their financials, and they think they're clever because they put a password on it. And those are easy, and there's a lot of ways of how to break into those. So hopefully I've gave you a lot of stuff to kind of think about. I'll try to, as we go along with this team thought experiment, if you're here, I've got an account out there. I'm Darin Fredde online. Hit me up with it. If you got a really cool tool or something, or on your journey trying to solve this problem, you come up with something, let's collaborate. If you know anything about the product I mentioned earlier, give me a second, Scavenger. Know anything about Scavenger, be sure and tell me. I'd like to know about it, how your success rate is it, any type of bash scripting or anything they have like that you've automated, like to hear. There's my references, guys, for you to kind of look up some stuff and some other stuff I may not have said. Any questions? I like SQL Map, and then there's also, I can't remember the name. I was actually mad that I didn't have my sides, but it actually leads to a whole nother topic. But there's actually like PowerShell, there's SQL. I can't remember the name of it. It's I use it all the time. It's in Power Up, and it's got some SQL. It's really good for enumerating SQL. And then I got a really good reference guide on DB2 and databases that I'm less familiar with queries on. And I've got a book that's dedicated to nothing but databases. And I can give you the name of it. I like that one because I use those to find connectors. Like I said ODBC, a lot of us that are IT people, we know those, but things like OLE, you know, things that maybe you're less familiar with, a .NET or something like that, though that reference is good for me. Did it kind of answer your question vaguely? What was it? Squirrel SQL. Okay. Yeah. Wirefall said that he was using Squirrel SQL. Did I say that right? Okay. So you guys want to do that? I'll definitely add that to the slide. Yeah, that's just what he's doing right now is what I'm looking for. I mean, because remember, we don't know everything. And hopefully I've showed you some ideas that you didn't think about. So about using tools and bending them to your will. No? Okay. Anybody else? By the way, that's my office. I just like to show off. Um, those are my little hash cracking, cheap hash cracking that I do on one box and everything. So if you find hashes, I pull those down and crack them as I'm going along and stuff. So half the battle for me is trying to figure out what the heck it is, because you get some weird ones. Like I don't think I knew what an XOR was in coding, but I didn't know what the specific one was for that IBM was using. So you get stuff like that. You have to research all the time. So I have a lab, and I do that in my lab. And I like a lot of real estate for viewing space. So that's my lab at home. Any other questions? Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I like to give out the slides. Feel free to mark them up, or, say, hey, that wasn't in there. What was that you did? I don't like stealing other people's methods. I actually have a guy at work that's a good friend of mine, and I'm going to encourage him to share. He's got needle in a haystack and some stuff he's written himself that I really like, but I'm not going to demo that because I don't want to steal his thunder. So there's some other ways of scripting things. So don't think I don't use those. I just don't want to show those because they're not mine. But I try to draw reference to everything I use. I think that's the responsible way to do it, is to cite my work. So yeah, slides will be available. How about anybody else? You had a question? Okay, yeah, the question was, how long did it take me to get good at finding stuff? I got lucky a lot at the very beginning, to be honest with you. I wasted a lot of time though, trudging through things that didn't matter and making mistakes with regex is what I told you. Because regexes are really bad about throwing a lot of false positives. And the last thing you want to do is run your regex as you're doing other things. And then you go back to that machine after it's running for 8 hours and you got all junk. And you have to go through that junk, and you have to go through it because you collected it all and you got to make sure something isn't there. So that's why I kind of encouraged you through learning experience to kind of, I call it a sniper gun, make sure your rifle is scoped in on your own data and that it works pretty well before you point it at something to try to find something. You'll save yourself a lot of nightmare. But I like finding unusual things like like zip files that are zipped, or I've found binaries. I've actually searched some of the tools I'm using, believe it or not. I guess the way they compiled the binary or whatever, I was actually could see in the binary, and I was getting data. I was like, why am I seeing this data? And I would also, and a binary, by the way, is an executable, like an exe is called a program for other non-technical people. And I actually could see data, and I've seen it in really weird file format. So it's all about the tool and searching in it. And so you'll learn a lot about file structures. And remember, I'll go over that again. It's about searching it within the context of files. Because like semi-structured data is a fancy way of saying XML. And I'll end with this one. One time I was at a company, they said, man, we definitely don't have credit card data. We've been broken in 3 times. You're not going to find credit card data. That was what I was told. And it was true. They'd been broken in 3 times. And the CEO did the walk of shame, I think, twice. That's where he has to explain to the public why he just lost their data. And so it becomes real sensitive to them. And they had went through and they basically, I forget the word I'm looking for. I know it real well. It's just my mind. They basically removed all their credit card data. They had surrogate data in there. And no, it's tokenized. Thinking they've tokenized all the data. And what happened was I came along and I found credit card data, and they argue with me, no, it isn't. And what it was is and remember I said semi-structured data. I left that hanging out there because what was happening is customers were coming to the website. The website URL was, the credit card was here. Underneath it was the actual window for the credit card. This one was what's called a varchar, which means anything goes, text, number, whatever. And the customer's just doing a simple thing. They were making a mistake and they were typing the data in the varchar window, the wrong form. And it would propagate through the, Okay, it would go through the data and get saved in an XML file. And the XML file is what we call semi-structured data, or that's what I call it. And the XML file was on a server. So when I came along doing the structured, of course, I get a hit on it. And I'm seeing it. And because I can search within the content of the file, I'm seeing all these credit card data. And so that's what it was. So the solution obviously was to fix the varchar so that it doesn't happen. And it was happening over a period of time. But if you got to think, statistically, 1 out of 50, you know, that adds up to a lot of data. And to a company been broken into a couple of times, it got people's attention. So you find stuff like that. I found one database, Wirefall asked about that. I got into the database and basically I found the secrets, the database config file. I like to go through config files and I read lines and I search on the config files because it tells me where the database is a lot of times. And it not only tells me that, it tells me what port to look for because people get clever and they change their ports around. And so it tells me what it is and it saves me a lot of time. And then I'll go into the databases and I went into a test database. And we all know, guys that have been doing it for a while, you're not supposed to use live customer data in a test database. So I found all this credit card data in a test database and said, hey, your developers using test data. It's all in these forms and here they are. So it really pays to kind of do this and I encourage you to do that. Any other questions? Man, I appreciate it. I hope I didn't wear you out. I tried to go purposely a little longer to kind of make it interesting. I hope it wasn't too weak of a conversation with you and we can talk offline, about technical things. I would love to talk to you. Thank you. And it was a real pleasure talking to you guys.